a fervent advocate of a pan-European accelerated birth cohort study. It was something I recommended to the European Commission whilst I was at the OECD after reviewing the availability of child wellbeing data in OECD countries, but it was a European Commission project. I'm sure some of you will have heard what I'm about to say, but since I last spoke to this group, I've done a bit more work, and so I've added a few more things. Let me see, do I have control? Great. So what do I want to say? In terms of child wellbeing internationally, not just in Europe, inequalities are large, and they're likely to get wider. I think that's primarily because policies are unequal and sometimes missing. Obviously, when you're outside of Europe, more of the policies are missing. In fact, sometimes entire systems are missing of social protection or child protection, and these drive unequal outcomes. I don't think there's a good argument for any country not paying for a full portfolio of family and child policies, but I do think that evidence drives the rationale for doing that, which is partly a reason I'm so keen that we have an accelerated birth cohort study in Europe. I want to talk a little bit about the type of data we have available to us now and run the rule over the quality of some of that data. I think over recent years, certainly in the past decade, the number of child wellbeing comparisons in Europe has and globally has grown. There's what's it called? There's indices related to child development and social development all over the place, sometimes looking at inequality, sometimes looking at levels, often at the country level, juxtaposing indicators of children of different ages. It's a crowded field, but the data's not been there to help us really understand what's happening in terms of child development by age, or indeed whether a set of child wellbeing indicators for children under 6 would look different for children aged 6 to 11, or indeed children in adolescence. On my last count, which I admit it was in 2019, there were only 26 birth cohort studies globally that I could find, and just 10 in low and middle income countries. And they're necessary to help us understand the interplay of child wellbeing outcomes, as well as answer questions about what should we do first when trying to promote optimal child wellbeing. There's good discussions about transforming, reimagining education. That's where most of the money goes when a country spends on children. If you're in Europe, it's about 60%. If you're in Africa, it's about 90%. Education carries a lot of the burden, needs to do a good job. There's been transforming education discussions, but we're still collecting information on literacy and numeracy and standardized tests, and you'll see what comes out from UNESCO later. I'll talk a bit about that. Still focused on foundational literacy and numeracy. And we need to integrate policies. Life is complex, development is complex. Governments know that policy portfolios need to be coherent and complementary, and sometimes the efforts of Sector A accrue in Sector B. And unless we compile our collections of child wellbeing under particular surveys, which also have time elements, it's going to be very difficult. And I've tried this twice to put the evidence base together and talk about the evidence of cross-sectoral and intersectoral approaches to policymaking. So I think I've said some of this. Evidence drives decisions. Data needs child inequality, wellbeing inequalities are linked. We need better data to change the discourse. I don't think the human capital discourse, as long as it's been going on, is serving us very well. I think it's the reason some of the child policy portfolios I'll show you in a minute look like the way they look. And there's a need to understand child wellbeing interconnectedness over time. So there's a need for more longitudinal data. It doesn't mean we don't, for those of you in the room who think that I'm certainly not saying that we don't need evaluations or experiments, we don't need monitoring data, but when it comes to types of data we collect, it's horses for courses, which is an English phrase meaning you pick your data for your purpose. I wrote OECD's first child wellbeing index, and the first one that was presented to the European Commission, and the first one that UNICEF also did with colleagues, of course. I'm not so prolific. But there was a lot of compromises on the data front. We were juxtaposing sources and concepts without clear consideration of age in those pictures. And I think I can show you some of this now. Oh, quickly about inequalities. I assume the room is full of excellent professionals that really don't need me to tell you about inequalities in child wellbeing within Europe or globally. But I will nonetheless, just very quickly. If you look at the right-hand side of this is pre-COVID data on child poverty in Europe, because it ranges from, that's relative income child poverty, the threshold's at 60% of the median income in the entire population. That's a proportion of children living under 60% of that threshold, the median income. And it ranged from a low in Denmark at 1 in 10 children, to nearly 1 in 3 children in Romania. Child poverty is intrinsically linked to all of the other well-being factors that we'd like to discuss, particularly early years home environments, where parents are detached from the labour market, and safe, stimulating environments are important for child development from innate human skills onwards. I'm doing some work for LACRO, the Latin American Caribbean region. Right now, I just pulled this out as fertility rates. Their average rates are well above global rates. So even there's massive differences, and the progress on indicators are different in different regions of the world. I'm also doing some work with MENA. This is looking at, that's Middle East and North Africa. This is just looking at antenatal care visits. You can see that just 1 in 5 children in Djibouti get access to antenatal care visits. And well, all of the kids in Bahrain are getting it, but across countries, differences by urban, rural, high to low income matters. And I think if you were to dig down subnationally in any one of the indicators we look at, you'll find sort of, what do we say, country variable distributions, for want of a better term, and therefore it sort of underlines the necessity to be collecting micro level data. So we want data that is micro level, that covers a lot of child wellbeing outcomes, that accounts for age development. That's another reason I think longitudinal birth cohort study in Europe is a good idea. Oh, and this something I published with OECD before I left. Oh, I went too fast. I didn't want to show you that square just yet. Okay, it's gone. That basically on the x-axis, this is the share of child wellbeing. It indicates a country has that, where their country's in the top third of performers in the OECD. And on the y-axis, it's when countries are top third performers in adult well-being. There's no clear correlation, and there's lots of variance. But I like this square over here, which is where there's no country that does well in child well-being that doesn't do well in adult well-being. If you were to put a square in the other corner, you'll find maybe at least 3 countries sitting in that box. Okay. So what's available for measuring child well-being until we get a decent longitudinal birth class? I won't stop laboring the point. So yeah, with a colleague from OECD some years ago, I took stock of available data. I think the same surveys they're still going on. There's not been major changes to what they're collecting. The exception is perhaps Children's World Survey. categorized the number of questionnaire items by the type of how the information is collected and by binary, nominal, ordinal scales, and then the categories that we generally use to monitor, measure, and understand children's well-being. The majority of the indicators are related to material issues, health. There are a fair amount of subjective perceptions and opinions, and they will go up. There's a lot of scales there. I think it's mainly to do with Cantrell's ladder. A couple of factors. This study I've been writing for the UNESCO, which will be published in the next month, has looked at a large literature review. We've looked at over 200 studies that first linked child well-being to foundational literacy, and then home conditions to child well-being, and then policies to home conditions. Found very strong connections between housing conditions and stability with children's detachment from services, their risk of violence, risk of school dropout in high, low, middle income countries, and family relationships, absolutely critical. There's no point in having books in the house when in preschool if parents don't have time, interest, and engagement to unlock those resources through strong interpersonal relationships and the practices that are needed, or let's say the optimal practices for doing so. We don't know enough about these things is basically what I'm saying, and they are as important as income security and material deprivation. I think we need to, as a group, we could sit down and really question how much of what we've been using over the years is just proxy for the things we really, really want to look at. Which is, relationships for me would certainly be one. Okay, and this is data coverage by age. Again, this is something from the House Life study. I don't think there's been major changes. Again, these are from different surveys. This hides a multitude of sins, but it turns out that some key things: social connection, civic engagement, education, and skills, quality of school life, they're coming from school-based surveys, HBSC, for instance, PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, SPAD. The ones with long coverage, security, health status, and so on, they're coming from health series. For some reason, health series use a different age categorization than others. It runs up to 19. The others, housing conditions, etc., from household surveys. So these are kind of the coverage by age, and there's huge gaps in child well-being in the early years outside of the basic conditions of housing and health status. And personal security there is actually measured using intentional homicide rates. So it's not exactly like lower levels of risk of severe or less severe physical violence. It's not enough. So is it any good? Is the data we've got available to any good? Is it inclusive? Is it accurate? From school-based surveys, I wrote a paper with Soo-Yeon Kim and Siguru Mizanoya for the Global Education Monitoring Report for UNESCO in 2020 that looked at exclusion from assessments. That means PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, SACMEC, PASEC, TERSE, any international assessment of literacy and numeracy in school. It's important for understanding that for well-being, not just for the education results, but also because the background data in most of those surveys on the socioeconomic demographics and children's opinions and position and whatever else it might be, they're also included in these assessments. The data we get on bullying, except for HBSC, is in background questionnaires of education survey. The same with life satisfaction. PISA captures most of that. So there's so many ways children can be missing from these surveys. I think what they have is they suffer from country level variable bias of the type that for me means they don't mean much, not at least the way most people manage that data. I think post hoc weighting and adjustments would help, and I don't think I've ever read a paper that has really taken that on. So this first stage one is that you're in a country where there's no collect school-based survey. In Europe, that's not the case, but globally, there's a lot of countries like that. Or that you're excluded from the target population, you're the wrong age, you're in the wrong grade, you have special educational needs, you're taught in a different class or a different school. PISA will tell you that they have limited exclusions from their target populations, which is great, but we're interested in the child population. Then there's exclusion from the collection. So you're in a country with data, you're part of the target population, but it's collected in schools and you don't have a good attendance rate. You have a chronic health problem. You've been excluded for behavioral issues. You're pretty much exactly the type of person we need to be speaking to, but you're not in the data. And then you can be excluded from surveillance. I'll show you a bit about this. Modality of collection is interesting. I won't show you but we do look at the fact that migrant kids in PISA tend to have lower non-response rates when using an iPad as opposed to pen and paper. It's always I don't know how to solve this. Perhaps people can help puzzle me this. What is the effect of undertaking literacy studies, testing literacy levels with pen and paper, pencil and paper tests? It doesn't just affect anyway, you'll see. Anyway, and then there's the last thing is on statistical invisibility. So you're in there, you've answered as many questions as you can, the modality's not put you off, your literacy rate's high enough, but you're going to be invisible because you're not good at answering key identifiers that are used to control in complex analysis, like what job your dad does. And that's pretty common. You'll find there's lots of kids that don't do a good job in answering those questions, and it's partly to do with parental relationships. Again, the type of kids we want in the survey and in the analysis are missing. Sorry, I went on too long. Someone's got a flag if I've gone too far. So a quick look at special educational needs. This is old, but it's my favorite chart and all the things, because this is the number of children excluded, with special educational needs statements in 2008, 2010. There's the correlation just shows there's not an awful lot of change. This country up here is Finland, with an exclusion rate in 2010 of around about 8%. That means those kids don't get a look in on the PISA test. And here's Sweden with its mainstreaming, where the exclusion rate is the lowest in Europe. And despite a lot of similarities between Sweden and Finland, which most of us outside of those two countries would probably say that's true. I'm sure there's more nuances if you live in either one. But Finland does very well on the PISA tests and Sweden not so much. And I don't think excluding 7% more of the child population is insignificant. And that's just the same. And oh, hang on, sorry, I'm messing this up. 1, 2. I blame it on the COVID. If I'm slow, if I go in the wrong direction, it's because of COVID. This is just the same type of thing. The data's a bit later. Finland's still around about 8%. It's doing better though, 7.3. Sweden's also doing better, 1.1. A huge variation in children with special education needs statements in European countries who don't get a look in on our school-based surveys. This looks at bias in the response by type of item. it looks a bit complicated, but I'll explain the first piece on the far left, where you can see it says positive and then a 0, 0, 0, and it says negative, it says 66, 57, 62. This is the number of countries out of the 72, 74 countries in PISA in 2016 that had significant differences in non-response rates by this indicator. So 66% of the 66 countries out of the 70 odd in PISA in 2006 had in non-response in relation to the tests of mathematics and reading, had higher rates, significantly higher rates of children with low economic status not answering questions. You go again over to the children with lower grades, many, many more not answering questions than those with higher grades. It changes a bit with sex, but still there's the bias in these results. That's just too many countries where too many children from disadvantaged backgrounds are not fully incorporated into the data and the analysis of PISA. Now, we can talk about item response theory or maximum likelihood estimation or filling in the gaps. But when we start filling in the gaps on both sides, both in terms of SES and in terms of literacy, then really what are we testing? It's endogenous. Okay, click. I won't. This is PISA students responding to fewer background items. So those with 0 to 10 non-response on the x-axis, and those with, 0 to 10% non-response rate, to 90 to 100% non-response rates. In the 3 years we've covered 2009, 12, and 15, you could see this U-shaped picture. So smarter kids are less likely to leave questions out. And that speaks to the analysis issue that we were talking about. Okay, so a bit on theory and evidence of child and human development. At least since the global financial crisis, countries have been saying we need to do better in understanding how our policies fit together. I mean, we'll go back to what's Bronfenbrenner 1977. His understanding of the complexity of human development and child development took a bit of time between the theory and the political will. We don't want to take a lot of time between the political will and the data, but that's the position we're in. I think there's two ways. This is a learning for wellbeing framework, by the way. It's just the same type of thing as Bronfenbrenner, except in the learning for wellbeing framework, we understand children at the center as being as complex as the ecological model which surrounds them, unique indeed. And it includes influencing and expressing, etc., which participation across the entire board, which Bronfenbrenner stopped at the meso system, but Bronfenbrenner didn't have the internet. So anyway, the difference between the time between the theory and the political will was what, 20, 30, 40 years? People are asking for integrated portfolios of child and family policy. They want to do it because they think it's more efficient, it'll save money, it's going to be more effective. Do we have the data to inform policymakers on what to do first in a portfolio of child and family policies? I would suggest we don't. We can try and piece it together with clever sort of literature reviews compiled on. But what we really need is longitudinal data. This is what makes me, it's a wonderful study. I wrote it with colleagues, but it looks at innate human skill development. And it's important that we recognize this happens across time, across life. Children develop at different rates, different speeds, but there's ranges in which key development aspects are there. I mean, from in utero. Okay, just quickly, what makes me is the idea, the premise behind it is that if we want to aim for complex skills like a degree in engineering, then we need to do less complex skills like pass an international baccalaureate across a range of subjects. Before that, we're looking at foundational literacy skills. But before that, maybe we need social and cognitive skills. But before that, what do we really need is innate human skills, the ability to listen, to relax, to empathize, to reflect. And this is what that study was about. And we see that in utero, listening, empathizing, inquiring are all skills children develop and can be measured and affected before a child speaks. You may have read the paper about German babies crying with German accents and French babies crying with French accents. Infants, I should say, newborns. There's listening in utero, and it's no surprise to people. Discerning patterns, embodying, which is related to executive functions, embodying, observing, reflecting, relaxing, and sensing things before preschool. There's fluency in adolescence of those things. It becomes complicated as children are experimenting, things fall away, like empathetic, so effective empathy, particularly in boys. Self-regulation becomes a problem. And the speed and type of development also matters. It's there. And we've studied this using compiled literature reviews. You know, sort of saying, well, this paper's looked at A and B, and this one's looked at B and C, so we're going to make inferences about A to C. That's not enough if we're really going to be changing policies that are worth billions and billions of dollars across Europe. We need that longitudinal data, and we need to be looking right from the start. So if we don't, we end up in positions where we don't have the data to inform, integrate, and coherent age-related child well-being policy. We know that one policy affects another. Lowering poverty increases health outcomes, improves education, gender equity, employment. But we don't know beyond a dyad, maybe 3 factors. And so we only have inferences. And there's a problem in countries with very little money and very little political will to engage in family and child policies, particularly in the early years, because this is like a European early years portfolio in the red, that so across the top it's child age, prenatal 17. This is the type of policies that would be in a child policy portfolio. All the business is going on in the early years. You saw from my data mapping, we don't have good data on child well-being in the early years. We don't have good information on their environments and their interpersonal relationships. We don't have good information on their safety. We don't have good information on their home learning environments. And yet a lot of the work is being done in this part of in terms of policy, in this part of the life course. And we need to do better to make sure that's done well. Okay, I'm down to my last couple of slides. You'll be glad to hear. I just want to point out, this is what Hegman would suggest, how we spend money across the life course, cash benefits. Preschool and childcare is the wrong color. It's the education in kind of public works is right. The preschool and childcare shouldn't be that color. It should be white. That's around here. That's the preschool and childcare. You start supporting families with cash benefits when they detach from the labor market. You leave no gap in the portfolio before they enter preschool. You go into education. You consistently deliver on minimum income. You consistently deliver on the types of policies that protect children from risk. Well, what are countries doing? Here's Norway. Not so bad. Norway seems to have all the things we need. Good, strong investment in around maternity. This is Argentina. Not so good, particularly around the very key innate skills area. There's not a lot of investment in children. That cash transfer is going mainly to the poorest, but it's conditional, I believe. And we're spending more as children pass through the life course. This is not what Professor Heckman would like to see. If you grow up in Ethiopia, it's just education. And it really kicks in if you get to higher education. And those differences in the profiles is why I was saying that inequalities are going to grow. not just within countries, but between countries. Whereas if Europe is getting the models together, not perfect, but getting it together, investing in the early years, and they are, about 27% of total goes in the early years, whereas in Africa, it's less than 6%, and there isn't any child protection, and there are only a few social protection systems. Europe is gonna move on a pace. And within Ethiopia, the kids that stick to the system are going to do better. Okay. Last thing on crisis-proof data. The cost of living crisis has shown us, and this is worth reading, colleagues in Innocenti wrote this, has taught us that our measurement of child poverty in Europe is not fit for purpose, not fit for crises. I'm writing a paper with Kihasa in Korea to assess whether child well-being measures are crisis-proof. Do they measure the crisis? Do they make sense in a crisis? Are they elastic enough? Turns out that when the problem for poverty risks is in consumption as opposed to in income, it's not going to turn up in European poverty figures. So don't expect a big change in child poverty in Europe, despite the fact that more than 3 million children will be experiencing income poor conditions. We need to do better. All right, I'm going to stop there. I think I gave my main messages throughout, and I hope I've not run over time. Thanks, everybody.